And we are live. There we go. The scariest part of all of these, and I feel like I say this on every webinar that I do, the scariest part is always waiting for those participants to come up as we start throttling and making sure that everyone's coming through Zoom. As always, for anyone that's come to the events before, and I'll just summarize it for anyone that hasn't come to one of the hackajob webinars, we won't be opening up the floor to live questions from an asking perspective, so from a vocal perspective, simply because we have way over 100, and I'm wondering where this is going to stop because it still continues, people that are at the event so far, so we just wouldn't have time to do it that way. But if you want to ask questions, if you can please use the Q&A functionality, and what we have already done is we've siphoned some time into this webinar, about 10, 15, 20 minutes at the end, where we'll be asking questions from the audience. We've had a couple of questions come in beforehand, so we will get to your questions. I guess while we wait for everyone to join, how's everyone's week going from a panelist perspective?
Pretty good so far. Nothing catastrophic has gone wrong.
Always a good start.
All the days bleed into one, but apart from that, it's fine.
It feels, doesn't it? Like I just lose track of days. I was chatting to someone earlier and I was like, how is it Wednesday already? I don't even know what day it is. So I feel very much your pain. What time are we on now? Nicholas, how's your week gone so far?
Yeah, fine, thank you. Yeah, a lot of stuff going on this time of year with objective settings. We're finally starting to see the back of that and actually getting down to the hard graph now. So I'm grateful for that shift towards being a technical person again.
Yeah, normality coming back to the world. Cool. So let's start. So just so the audience know what we'll be going through today. So we've obviously got the amazing team at Moneysupermarket Group. What we'll be going through is development story, embracing DevOps, CI/CD-ish, a look at what's to come, and then, like I say, at the end, we will be doing a Q&A. So I will leave you in the capable hands of Chris Owen to start with, and then Nick Hirst will be going afterwards. Over to you, Chris.
Okay, hi guys. So I'm Chris Owen, I'm Chief Architect for the Moneysupermarket Group. And today, really, we're just going to be talking a little bit about Moneysupermarket and also a few kind of stories about some of the projects we've been working on recently in the money space, which is why we brought Nick in, who's one of our tech leads for one of our engineering teams. Next slide. So just a quick introduction for Moneysupermarket. Hopefully, you've all seen adverts and used us for one of your sort of financial needs. But we are a price comparison site. We've effectively got actually now 4 offices across the UK in London, Manchester, and in North Wales. We've got about 800 colleagues and 4 distinct brands that we've set up, all based around a common purpose. The brands you're probably aware of is moneysupermarket.com, but we also run Money7Expert, which is obviously founded by Martin Lewis, which is more of a consumer-focused champion for customer rights and getting them the best deal. Travel Supermarket is a travel price comparison business. Decision Tech is basically a specialist company who look at broadband and mobile phones, but also are starting to open up a B2B platform so we can share our services with other businesses who want to use some of our price comparison expertise. Next slide. Just a little bit about Moneysupermarket from a kind of a historic point of view. We started as a way for brokers to get information about mortgage deals in the mid to late 90s. But around about the sort of .com boom, we moved into kind of a consumer website with moneysupermarket.com. And back then, technology-wise, it was a mix of Visual Basic, VB scripts, classic ASP. Around about 2004, we opened our first sort of large office in Ulo in North Wales, and we also began a re-platform of the applications to C# and ASP.NET. Over the course of the next few years, we became PLC. We started growth into multiple data centers, and we also have this kind of experienced sort of rapid growth as we looked into different verticals, like so car insurance, home insurance, etc. But we did start to see some technology silos appear, which we'll talk about in a little while. A few years later, Money7 Expert came on the group, and we started to maybe have a bit more of a shift to think about our brands as needing a sort of a common platform to serve a lot of the shared needs across them. So there are different behaviors and different functionality that each of the brands needs, but there are certain common things from an infrastructure and a platform point of view that need to power them. 2013 was kind of a really sort of massive radical shift for us, because that's when we started to move our systems into AWS. We also moved a lot of our technology across to Java microservices, and we put in place a new CMS with Adobe Experience Manager. And just, well, actually 2 years ago now, we opened a technology hub in Spinningfields, Manchester. So that's where probably the big majority of our technology team is based these days, but we do have technology teams in the London offices and ULO as well, for certain areas. Next slide. So I was talking about why we'd ended up with sort of technology silos and what that really meant. So it helps me to just kind of explain a little bit about price comparison, what it is that we do. But essentially, we're a vertical search business. We search in one particular area, be it car insurance or travel insurance or home insurance. And each of those businesses have got a lot of common elements. We typically ask a customer some questions and show them results. But from a technology perspective, the variance is all to do with where we get those products from. In car insurance, every quote is personalized. It's an individual quote from insurers. So for that application, we make real-time calls to insurer APIs, probably about 100 calls every time every individual customer submits a form. For something like energy, it's very different. An energy product is pretty much just based on what your consumption is and what your location is. But it's so we effectively use a calculation engine. So we have all the tariff data in our database that we use to do that calculation. Borrowing is a little bit of a mix of both. So when we show credit cards, what we do is we have a database of all the credit cards we know about, but we also make calls out to APIs to check with lenders, what cards are each individual customer eligible for. So each price comparison product, if you like, has got a lot of variance in the technology stack. What we tend to do is treat each of those separate products as products in their own right. When we moved to Manchester, we really wanted to organize our teams around the idea of product engineering teams, teams that are separate, devoted to, say, car insurance end to end, and have the autonomy to make the design choices they need to make that application work. Next slide. So that sounds great. What are the problems? So what we did notice when we did the shift is, although we had a new AWS microservice architecture that really supported what we wanted to do with these product engineering teams that had autonomy between each of the different areas, the one place that was starting to hold them back was the CMS. What we'd done in our first move to AWS was create a content management system that spanned the entire site. It was heavily consistent in terms of look and feel, used a lot of shared components, even in cases of building forms and results pages and more dynamic pages. That's great, but what we found is when we then wanted to split out the website so that different teams could effectively own different parts of the journey, that didn't really work. One of the biggest issues with teams just didn't have the flexibility to change something if they needed to do something different. So, for example, if they wanted to test an optimization on car insurance, because that was a shared component, they would end up having to make that change and affect all the other products as well, which is not something that we really wanted to do. We found that teams also didn't really have an awful lot of flexibility in terms of things like Frontend Frameworks. At the time, we were using AngularJS, pretty much a shared library that was included in everybody's browser at runtime. If a team wanted to do something different or use a different framework, they couldn't. It just wasn't possible the way the platform was set up. We just didn't have the flexibility that we needed. All in all, this just basically meant that teams weren't able to do the kinds of changes and get the kind of autonomy that they wanted to do. So we wanted to do something different, and that's when we sort of started looking at the micro frontends pattern. Next slide. So I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time talking about the pattern because there are lots of different flavors, but at a really high level, what it's about is really decomposing a website or a web application into smaller chunks. You know, that could be a web page, that could be, you know, a section of the website. It's very much kind of up to you in terms of how you would set it up. But really what you're looking for is, you know, simple code bases, release independence, you know, flexibility within each front end if you want to do, you know, to have different functionality, or even to optimize it for page speed or some particular sort of device that you needed. And the end result is you get more autonomy for the teams that are managing these things. It's not a perfect solution, and there are things that you kind of need to be aware of. One of the things that we're really concerned about was that if our journeys effectively spanned, you know, multiple front ends, and each front end had its own set of JavaScript libraries, would the customer end up in a situation where they were downloading, you know, the same versions of particular libraries 2 or 3 times because each micro front end bundled its assets separately? So there was a concern about, well, could this lead to kind of worse impact of things like page speed? Another concern is potential duplication. You know, one of the prime drivers for moving to a CMS was this idea we could have, you know, common template, common branding, consistency, and it'll all be built in automatically. Move to micro front ends, and well, yeah, we've got flexibility, but you've also got the flexibility to do things that you might not want to do. You know, to change the color scheme, to change, you know, the recommended fonts and branding. So there's a certain amount of governance that we need to think in terms of that would allow. But also, you know, is it faster? You know, shared frameworks and shared CMSs are great. In theory, they can deliver you common components, allows you to do things faster. Will we get the same kind of impact in micro front ends? And that was kind of a problem we needed to think about. Next slide. So that was the sort of the pitch. What I'm going to do now is kind of move over to sort of Nick Hirst, who's our tech lead and on one of our money channels, to talk about how they picked this up and ran with this in the development team. Nick.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. As Chris said, I'm the tech lead on what is now the loans team. I've had roughly coming up 5 years with Moneysupermarket, so I was either fortunate or unfortunate enough to sort of see the tail end of where we were, and as we moved to the CMS solution, and then I took an opportunity as we opened our Manchester Tech Hub to develop this story. So I'm going to talk to you predominantly about the borrowing team and the journey that we've gone through since onboarding back in sort of Q4 2018, how we've developed up to today. It's worth noting that the way that sort of MSM is set up, especially in the Manchester Tech Hub, with our autonomous teams working on different sectors of the website, different channels, as Chris alluded to, this journey won't be the same as every other team's journey. But we will share some common themes, common challenges, and at times common solutions. So next slide, please. So what was the brief as we formed as a team, as we were getting going? I just wanted to highlight really the high level brief that we were given here. It's sort of a nod to the relationship that the architecture team has with the development team, whereby it is not a prescriptive, do it this way with this solution on this platform, but there are recommendations of a preferred tech stack, a preferred approach that is then discussed, shared with the sort of tech lead and filtered down to the teams. Those teams are then free to explore alternatives and come back with proposals the other way, and in some cases we're even able to take the decisions ourselves without that sort of feedback loop being necessary. However, the brief that we got was we want to migrate the existing Moneysupermarket money front-end journeys out of AEM's content management into micro front-ends using Vue.js. We also needed to pull out the Java backend that sort of orchestrates all of that front-end requests and the question sets and the results decisions out of that CMS system and into, where appropriate, Spring Boot microservices. Also on the money saving expert side, the borrowing eligibility journeys for credit cards and loans were being hosted and run by a third party, and sort of to move to the benefits of that product engineering mindset on Money Saving Expert, we needed to pull away from that white label so that we could make changes ourselves quickly. Next slide, please. So the team started with banking, the banking journeys. So this is as we are 3-4 engineers starting to be recruited into the Manchester hub. And the original idea was actually to be 2 teams, banking and borrowing. Although once the banking journeys were re-platformed, they were largely left alone. And so, as I explained throughout the journey, we continue as borrowing beyond this initial banking. But what did we do in the first instance? So the product managers and the UX teams were already well established for the banking channels. We're already onshore and had already completed a lot of research into the needs of the savings journey that had perhaps not had a lot of attention in the years leading up to us starting. So they had all of this customer insight and stuff, and we were given the sort of what we needed to do to re-platform. And we actually moved away from, for savings, a question set led journey where the users would be given information and being asked what kind of account you want. We really didn't particularly know what kind of account they wanted. They just wanted to say, I've got this much money, what should I do with it? So that product engineering mindset is starting to be established. And as a tech team, we're forming some early decisions on not just on tech, but on our ways of working. And whilst there were some early trip ups, we did make some strong early architectural decisions that, although they've evolved over time, are still sort of the foundation of what we do, and has held us in a good footing. So the first main one is sort of we built a Spring Boot microservice, which is a backend for front end, which for savings just started life as the orchestrator of the search functionality. And for the front end, as we move from savings into current accounts on the banking re-platform, we realized the need, that there was some duplication and the need to bring in reuse where possible. So we started to develop a view components library of things like the buttons, the drop-down lists, the sliders. And that was just, at first, was a simple NPM repo that we could import into the different banking and, the savings and current accounts journeys. The next slide, please. So as we moved off that re-platform of the banking journeys, we were to move into the money saving expert eligibility journeys. But this required a mind shift in the way the team was working, because technically with the banking apps, everything had been hosted in AEM still, so that the app was packaged as a content package and plonked into AEM. So the things like the infrastructure, the pipelines for releasing code were all already there for us, and we inherited that from the offshore team as we started. And so we had to start to embrace the ops side of DevOps. Next slide, please. So, as I said, this was the first time we had to think about hosting apps in environments and how to get them there. So the leads in the team, including myself, started to encourage and to some extent force a mindset that encouraged developers to get hands-on with the ops work. Now we'd always had since the start an inline DevOps engineer, and we used to sort of do the, okay, Mr. Engineer, we need a pipeline, we need a X piece of infrastructure. Whereas as we moved into the eligibility journeys on MSE, we wanted to shift that relationship with the ops engineer to be more of a consultation, whereby we as devs were saying, we need this, can you recommend any patterns? Have we done this before? And we would roll our sleeves up and get our hands dirty with developing those pieces of infrastructure. So some decisions that we made as we moved into the MSE re-platform were adopting Jenkins seed jobs so that you're not sort of hand cranking pipelines, mainly to get around some permissions issues that we had. Pipelines as code, so that we could be checking them into source code, and being able to create shared Jenkins libraries so that as we roll out more pipelines, we can get reuse of those component parts of the pipelines. Again, a nod to the sort of architectural steer, we developed, we used Nginx as a reverse proxy for our front-end web apps. And we were, as I mentioned, able to consider alternative solutions, including hosting the web apps in S3 instead. And we had some issues around that between subtle elements of the shared platform of Moneysupermarket as a whole and Money Expert as a whole around sort of session management. So that's why we went down the Nginx route. The engineers had sort of foundational level understanding of Docker and building Docker images for a local development environment, but had never built them for a production environment before. And they definitely had nothing more than sort of a tutorial level understanding of Helm and Kubernetes at the time. And so we were leaning on that ops engineer to help guide us into those patterns and reuse the existing sort of Helm platform and setup that was already in place, so that we could do what we wanted to do as quickly as possible. So this newfound understanding of the ops world led us to want to progress in sort of CI/CD. And I've sort of put ish around here because I think our definition, or even our current process as a mature team, we probably don't fit into the textbook definition of what CI/CD is or should be. And as well, other teams in Moneysupermarket possibly share a difference of opinion. But our general driver towards this CI/CD was we just wanted to ship code quickly into prod and automate what we could as we got more confident with DevOps. So how did we move into this space, and how did we go? Next slide, please. The teams set up a number of working groups, and people were encouraged to join the working groups that they had personal interest in. And the two working groups that were established in the borrowing team at the time were for CI/CD and monitoring and alerting. So CI/CD's sort of set of principles, the topics, the purpose of the working group was to agree a roadmap of what the path to prod looked like and had to do, not only to satisfy our own aspirations of getting stuff out quickly and automated, but to satisfy the wider organization's governance and what we call the SDLC, which is loosely a set of governing principles for shipping code to prod. And as well, that reassured our stakeholders that this shift to automation didn't result in any sort of detriment to quality or a timely release. And the monitoring and alerting groups agreed a set of bronze, silver, gold standards for our apps that said whether how we can monitor our apps and know whether they are failing before our customers do, which sort of the two go hand in hand really, getting stuff to prod and then knowing that it's happy go hand in hand. So decisions that were made, mainly talking around CI/CD by the working groups, include spikes that we did around Test Cafe and other tools, but we rounded on Test Cafe and rolled that out to all of our front-end apps. Jest for the unit tests, Browser Stack for cross-browser automation testing. In our API integration, we moved from Rest Assured to Karate because we knew that our QA specialists needed and wanted to be involved in our QA process, and because we were moving for more automation, we needed a platform which was a bit more language agnostic, in that Karate is a lot more sort of JSON and BDD language out of the box, as opposed to Rest Assured, which is very Java heavy. Although in its early stages, we're looking into packed contract testing between the front ends and the back ends. And at the back end last year, we had a really strong push to get all of the money apps, as they were in our money domain, into what we call V1 of our CI/CD definition. This wasn't actually, by V1, it wasn't actually going to prod at that point, but the entire pipeline was automated up to the point in a UAT environment that all that was required was a simple sort of manual smoke test of the criteria of the particular ticket that was being released. These cross-squad working groups actually had an unexpected benefit that up until the point of the teams being formed and in its the working groups, we were one big team, but that big team of borrowing as more and more engineers onboarded into the Manchester teams was becoming quite a large team, and we were being encouraged to split up into, at the time, loans and cards, and one other smaller team for another small project. These working groups gave the unexpected benefit of early foundations of a collaborative way of working that across cards and loans we still hold really strong as a way of achieving common goals in common architecture, although we are now separate teams and do have separate apps. Next slide, please. So the evolution of this, obviously we haven't stood still. We have done the banking replatform, the MSE eligibility replatform of both the question set and the results on cards and loans, and we're on the MSM replatform, and we've just, both teams have finished the question sets. But this hasn't been just a cookie cutter, boring, okay, we've finished one, on to the next, fill in the content and ship it. We've evolved both our processes, our technologies and our ways of thinking as we've gone along. So I thought I'd just share with you some of the things that we've done in that space. Next slide, please. So all of this evolution and innovation has grown out of sort of Moneysupermarket's core behaviors, really. They champion three core behaviors: to create belonging, grow and develop, and innovate to deliver. So as well as the various working groups that I've already mentioned and the sort of typical technical guilds that most big tech firms have around, Java Developer Guild, QA Guild, the company also has regular tech show and tell days, internal team brown bags, and we as a borrowing team actively encourage our developers to bake a full day's work into any sprint cycle for innovation projects. So this focus on learning and development has actually moved on the core foundations and that brief that I gave you right at the start into a number of different ways. So that component library that was once a full NPM repo that you had to pull the whole thing down if you wanted to use just, say, the button component, has migrated slowly into Learner, which is a monorepo solution, so that the components can be individually consumed and keep your bundle size down. And the money team have actually sort of spearheaded the working group that then looks to roll out that platform, not just across money, but to be widely adopted across the whole group. In the backend space, we're moving towards an event and message-driven architecture using Apache Kafka. This enables those broker patterns that we've shared to be less chatty. So for the little sort of side of desk tasks that the customer, when the customer fills in a question set and updates, say, their communications preferences along the way, we can fire off an asynchronous request to handle that update of communications preferences without it being a blocking request for the customer, and we can be quicker to respond to the customer. Building on our evolution of our ops mindset, we one of the brown bags that I mentioned before was on a sort of a GitOps approach using Argo CD, and we sort of latched onto that as we built one of our new microservices in our rollout of the replatform, sort of moving away and removing our dependence on Jenkins as a man in the middle, and focusing on just committing code and the pipelines updating themselves, really. And again, one of the monitoring and alerting working groups meant that we came out of that wanting to have more awareness of what's going on our front-end apps, and we championed the acquisition of rollbar licenses into the organization as well. So all of these innovations and evolutions, as our team assures, and not just our team, other teams, the product engineering mindset continues to grow, and we are literally finding the balance of product and engineering. But as our quality and our delivery times and the amount of code that we're shipping increases, so too does that relationship improve with the product side of the product engineering. And so the tech asks that we're asking for, saying we would like to have a go at Argo CD or implementing a learner mono repo, is less of a hard sell, because we've sort of proven time and time again that that evolution ultimately ends up in good stuff on the other side of things. Next slide, please. So what's next? Despite the evolutions that I've nodded to there and the journey we've been on, there's still plenty to be doing in sort of this year and beyond for both the borrowing teams and the wider organisation. Let's move on and have a look at that. So the replatform, as I've said, isn't done. We've done MSE and the banking. We're currently working towards completing the results pages, hopefully in Q1 this year. We need to break up more of those legacy monoliths into smaller microservices, and there are other applications which have just not had a lot of love over the past year or so, and so they're perhaps looking to need a refactor or updating simple things like their, their Gradle versions, right up to more complicated things like the underlying software, perhaps moving from one dependency injection framework to another. We want to keep moving on that CI/CD, perhaps exploring more adoption of the Argo CD, exploring feature flags so that we can become truly CD with trunk-based development, and looking at having more awareness of our apps with new tooling for monitoring and alerting. And the big one, of course, the main reason for the replatform, as Chris called out right at the start, is to have more customer focus and to be able to leverage this new platform for fast iterative experiences of experimenting on our products and getting new stuff in front of our customers so that we can have a better solution for them. And of course, some things I can't even mention now because they don't exist as ideas yet. But as I said, the innovation that Moneysupermarket encourages is where some of our best ideas have come from, sort of come organically from the team innovation. And so who knows what's next based on what the team might discover along the way in the next month, quarter, year. And that's just sort of the money highlights. There's other teams across the organization doing various versions of replatforms, re-engineering, or complete throwing the old apps out and starting again kind of challenges. So in the whistle stop tour, that was sort of borrowing from 2018 to today.
Amazing. Cool. So we'll start with the questions that were already across beforehand. We had a couple that came across. So I guess starting with you, Chris, when we were going through the initial parts, you were talking about how you had you changed your tech stack from C# to Java. You and I had a bit of a conversation on it yesterday. It'd be interesting to get your takes so the audience can hear it too.
Yeah. So obviously this goes back probably not just shy of a decade. I think what started to happen is we had started to use a few more Java applications when we brought in some commercial software. And I think primarily one of the main concerns when we were looking at AWS was licensing. I think back then .NET was pretty much Microsoft only. Things like .NET Core and some of the flexibility we've got now didn't really exist. So we definitely, when we were thinking about a mass migration into AWS Cloud, the feeling was we wanted to be, onto open source from an OS point of view, and Java seemed like the best choice for that. So it was primarily a thing about licensing. Did involve quite a bit of retraining amongst the teams, but as I say, we'd already caught a little bit of a break because we'd already started a move from sort of .NET to Java as we brought in some more sort of open source commercial applications into the business before we moved to AWS. But yeah, I mean, it was just a case of, the cloud back in 2012, 2013, when we were looking at this was quite a different place. It's still quite mature, but there were just some limitations that maybe don't exist in the same way that they do today.
Amazing, thank you very much. And Nick, something I enjoyed on your side was we were talking about DevOps, and I think that DevOps sometimes is seen as a skill set, and then some people see it as a discipline. So it'd be interesting to get your take on that as well, because what you were talking about, the team internally at Moneysupermarket is set up in quite an interesting way.
Yeah, I think I actually agree with both sides of the argument, really, that a DevOps engineer is a specialist, and I think we shouldn't necessarily all strive to be good at all things. You know, people have specialisms, and those people have a place in the team. But equally, I think our move away from those inline engineers doing all the work for us, so that the rest of the team are perhaps blind to even what's going on after they hit merge, means that that's great. It actually means you go quicker when everything's going well. But how often are things not going well in things like pipelines, environments, infrastructure hiccups, stuff like that? So the ability for all hands on deck to solve, you know, live issues that are going on with that infrastructure, and to collaborate, and for people to learn more. Also, not only are you able to solve those problems quicker, if you have a broader knowledge, you are more comfortable in taking risks and trying new things, which then drives that innovation. But I think that consultation with a specialist will always be valued, or I would always champion it in the Moneysupermarket. I know at the moment we're moving away from inline teams to a set of specialists in their own team who are called upon in sort of a burst capacity. So, for example, if Money suddenly had more requirement for more than a single inline engineer to offer that consultation, we would perhaps draw on that resource more than other teams who are, you know, coasting along, just working on the product engineering side of the developments that they're doing.
Nice. And we touched on Vue as a framework about halfway through the presentation, but I know that Vue isn't the only framework used internally, because we were discussing it yesterday. But also, something that really interested me when we were talking was that actually you're open to candidates that come from other frameworks as well. They don't necessarily need to come in as a finished article. So can you tell us a little bit about why that is, like why you are so open to things on that side?
Yeah, so the Vue.js decision, I mentioned about the steer from architects. I know our front-end architect did an evaluation at the time of a number of frameworks, and React and Vue were the front runners. The main reason I think that they settled on Vue.js was because of the learning curve for those developers already in-house, and the ability that learning curve, if you'd come from React and other frameworks, meant that you could quickly switch over to Vue.js, but perhaps going the other way is more difficult. But as we also said, the teams are free to experiment and try different platforms. The Money team is predominantly in the Vue.js world, but the recruitment, I'm just thinking off the top of my head, but I think there's at least a third of the current cards and loans teams came from a React foundation, and we never prejudice on that in the interview process. You know, they get to do their tech task and whatever framework they see fit, and then we have a discussion about the choices that were made at the time and why. And then as they onboard as successful candidates, we invest in the time to help them find a pathway to moving from their say React to the Vue, and understanding our components and the way we've got it all wired together. So yeah, no prejudice on language choice or framework here.
Nice, amazing. I've kind of thrown a few questions at Nick, so I'm going to throw this one at you first, Chris, and then we'll see if we need to loop back Chris in. But Chris, Nick, during the presentation just then, he was talking about innovation and L&D and opportunities internally to increase your skill set. It'd be interesting just to get a bit of a feel about what that L&D and what that innovation looks like on a weekly basis.
Yeah, of course. So, I mean, obviously, say that the technology is moving too fast. So, if we weren't looking at, you know, individual needs from an L&D point of view, I think we'd find we'd end up, you know, not being able to keep up with the pace of technology and change that we wanted to. So, I think we sort of encourage teams to try and find time themselves for any kind of skill, for learning the skills they need to do. You know, experiment in sort of sandboxes to try and If they're going to, if a team is thinking of doing something in a different space, is there something we can do a prototype or some kind of proof of concept? Give them the time and the space to do that. I think it's quite important for us. Not all the prototypes can necessarily lead to something in production. I can think, last year we were, a team did an experiment on trying to use, I think it's Quarkus, and get kind of a Java framework in from the serverless space, just to understand how that would work for us. So from a pure technical point of view, it tends to be done in the team. From a company-wide point of view, in terms of wider training about compliance and data security and some of those issues, we do have a learning platform. I think Emma or Imran, who were also on the call from our recruitment teams, I don't know if you can give us a bit more information about that.
Hi, yes, you're quite right. Have the learning platform, which is called Grow, which is available to everybody. There are specific learning paths that people can subscribe to, or anything that's of interest for them, or they get specific learning paths shared with them. And we also have, on a slightly broader scale, our lead management development program as well. So there's lots of opportunity, whether it's from specific technical skills or more broader kind of managerial skills.
Perfect. And then I guess the elephant that is in the room at the moment for everyone is that kind of work from home piece. So I guess question would be, how have Moneysupermarket supported the engineers and overall the staff in order to transition over that last year period into the environments we work in now? And I'll throw that to you first, Nick, and then loop back to Chris.
Yeah, there's some sort of more like physical things that were done for us, and then some more just supportive things that were done. So from a physical point of view, as we first moved to remote working, the company repurposed something that was previously used for training and development, called the Freedom Pot, into just a cash sum that could be spent. I think it was £150, possibly £200, I can't remember the exact amount, but there was to be spent on home office equipment. So for example, I bought a second monitor, and I know other people have bought other bits, office chairs and whatever. So a very practical element there. As the pandemic started to unfold and the home learning thing started to become an issue, the company introduced its own version of furlough. It was not the government's furlough scheme, but it was called COVID Care Leave, whereby if people met certain criteria, I think as single parents or with children with SEN or something like that, they were able to voluntarily request to go onto that COVID Care Leave, with the support of the people team to make sure what that would look like for their career and how to support them through that. And then and as sort of a softer kind of just steer right from the top of obviously Moneysupermarket Group's started with one CEO at the start of lockdown, has transitioned to a new one. Both up to now probably spent about 6 months managing the company, but the steer right from the top came to be support and flexibility. So sort of at manager's discretion, blanket approval was given to whatever you thought was necessary to support your team. So in our team, I know people work sort of opposite shifts to their partners, for example. Some taking a morning shift and a night shift with their children, or partially reducing hours without any impact on take-home pay and stuff like that, just to sort of give people an extra 2 hours in the morning or afternoon to manage that homeschooling piece, and just generally a supportive managerial approach right through all the different various levels of the organisation.
Chris, I don't know if you've got anything to add there?
So not really. I think you covered that quite well. I think what I would say, and just in terms of sort of day-to-day, practical working, I think our network and service guys let's say we only opened our Manchester office a year or so ago. In preparation for that, we wanted to open up a lot of remote working opportunities just in general, just because so people had access to the right tools, the VPN was in a position where it needed to be. So in some ways, we sort of caught a break in that transition phase as we were moving into Manchester. Meant we were kind of working in various satellite offices as the office opened. So I think technically, I think most people, when we sort of made the call to say, right, everyone has to work from home, don't think we've hit too many issues in terms of blockers or people not having access to the systems they need to, which has been a big help. So I think the migration, certainly in those early weeks, it was it went reasonably smoothly. I think the longer things gone on, I think it's different when you move from a world where you're executing a plan that you've already had to kind of maybe 6-9 months in, when we're starting to think about what are the plans for next year and what do we need to do, because that's when you need a little bit more of a collaborative approach. And that's kind of one where we start to see, well, yeah, we need to start thinking about some collaboration tools. We use things like Miro for kind of shared whiteboards and that kind of shared design. But that's something I think we need to sort of continue to look at.
Makes sense. Emma, I'm going to throw a question with you now you're live on the call. I think a question a lot of people ask when looking at new organizations is that onboarding piece. Like, how do you get someone through that onboarding? And we've done it at hackajob in the last few weeks. It's very, very challenging. So how have Moneysupermarket coped with onboarding new members of staff in a lockdown environment?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think fortunately we were set up quite well for it before. We do use a specific onboarding tool called Onboarder, which just helps any new colleague joining learn more about the business. We get to learn about them. They've got regular contact with the manager, but obviously a lot of it is down to the individual manager and the teams that they'll be going into. So a lot of managers will set up kind of buddies for the new colleagues joining. They have a really well prepared induction, and I don't just mean kind of the main Moneysupermarket Group one that everybody's invited on, but actually making sure that the key people that they need to meet, they've got time booked in the diary, and they're really supportive. I think we've been really, really aware of it as a business, whether that's actually from Imran and my perspective of recruiting people and bringing them in, and they can't actually see the offices and they don't get to meet people face to face. How do we kind of humanise that process for them as much as possible, all the way through into onboarding and hopefully landing successfully? Perfect.
Chris, as we've been going on, has been answering a lot of the questions in the Q&A, but I'm just going to throw a few questions back at him just to make sure that everyone's seen the answers. So apologies, Chris, you'll be talking over yourself again. But so one of the questions came in, it was, what do you use for build system, Maven or Gradle, or something else? What advantage does your choice have?
So I think the predominant choice is Gradle, and that generally just seems to be the tool of preference for the team. I think they like the programmatic style a bit more than Maven. I think Maven it's great, it's what I've used in the past, but it can be a little bit confusing when you've got a massive XML file and can't find anything. I think a more programmatic approach seems to be the preference in most of the devs that we speak to. So we pretty much adopted that as a standard.
Cool, makes sense. Nick, feel free to answer add anything as we go along, but it sounded like you were quite happy with that answer by looking at your face. So with adopting the backend for front-end pattern, how do you co-locate your backend and front-end code from microservice into the same source code control repo, or keep them separate? Are they served in the same K8 pods or separately?
Yeah, so just sort of pitching. So we don't have a sort of defined pattern, and a couple of teams have done things slightly differently. I think one of the first ones that we looked in the car insurance space, they pretty much had quite a close coupling between their front end and their back end for front end code, almost in the same repository. I think in Money, Nick, we went down a slightly different route, because what you're finding is a lot of the BFF endpoints you needed were shared amongst a couple of different sort of micro apps. I think you separated it out. Is that right?
Yep, that's absolutely spot on. Can't really add any more to that. We have split them out as front and back end apps, and they are in their own Kubernetes pods as individual apps.
What we had in Money specifically, which is a little bit unusual compared to some of the other brands, but things like credit cards and loans, we've got in some ways the same application on both websites, heavily branded differently. So the front end itself is different, but the back end is very similar. And so there's a couple of different patterns we use, and it's up to the individual choice of the product. I don't think we've got a defined this is the way to do it.
Perfect. Next question. Hi guys, cool seeing Kafka plus microservices. How are you synchronizing the microservices shared data?
We don't have that much kind of shared data between the services. I think it's something we could do better at, to be honest. I think in a couple of places we've got a common reference data service that we use for lists and lookups. And what we do is we raise events when there's been a change. The services subscribe to those events and effectively know to update their local cache. I think it's something that needs a bit of an update. I think because I don't think we're using Kafka for that. I think we're still using Rabbit for that particular mechanism. But it's something we need to improve on because it is a little bit of a bugbear in the system at the moment.
Cool. You mentioned eliminating Jenkins as a man in the middle. Could you expand on how you did this? What did you replace it with? I think this one was yourself, Nick.
Yeah, so we replaced it with a sort of a GitOps approach, which again is we used Argo CD, but I think there are other ways of doing it. It's just a tool that helps you do it, and effectively you're just replacing it as code in itself. You still need a pipeline as such for Jenkins, but you're not relying on Jenkins firing Jenkins job after Jenkins job, for example, one job to build the tests, one job then when the tests are passed to deploy the Kubernetes pod. We have a Jenkins pipeline that writes a Git commit to say, okay, now the latest version of the application is the one tagged at the Git repo at version 1.2.3, and then Argo goes and notices a change in Git, with Git being the sort of the source of truth, and goes, okay, I'll go and read the Helm configuration for version 1.2.3, and I'll initiate an update to the Kubernetes pods. So we haven't, strictly speaking, we haven't cut out Jenkins as a middleman, but we've cut out that sort of pattern of Jenkins depending on Jenkins, in a nested way.
Perfect.
And I'm sure we could cut out Jenkins if we wanted to by, pulling out, but we'd only be replacing it with, say, GitHub Actions or some other sort of pipeline framework.
Makes sense. This came off the back of something we were talking about on the L&D question. It was mentioned you were looking at Quarkus. Have you decided to use it?
No, I think the actual team decided not to in the end. I think they were a little bit concerned about the boot time. So the time it was taken to compile the application. It was kind of one of these. I think we could have resolved that. I don't think it was a massive blocker to the team, but I think it was something they decided for the project they were working on. It's probably not the most practical choice. But I think it is something that we'll sort of look at again, because I think it was functionally working. I think there's any issues once things were in place. I think that was just a little bit of a concern about the sort of the ramp up time for the functionality.
Are there any state management libraries you use? Are these coupled to the JS frameworks used in any way, or are they more agnostic? Not
as a front end developer. There is a state management library we use. It is pretty decoupled. Can I remember the name of it? No. I don't know.
The answer for our micro front ends in that for our Vue apps for state management, we are using the Vuex. So that's predominantly coupled to the Vue framework. We're using Vuex for state management in our apps, but for the wider.
I think there is another one. A couple of teams have started using that's a bit more front end agnostic, but it's gone out of my head. But there is definitely one.
Have you tried dynamic module loading or module federation on the front end?
I think we have. I think it's something that our CMS team are looking at. I mean, one of the problems that we had, back when we had this more monolithic concept management system was we had a JavaScript library that had all the components in it that every page had to load, which was which was great for some pages, but if you've got a small page that's maybe only using one component, why would you download this massive JavaScript repo that had, or a JavaScript file that had everything in it? So I think this is something that they're looking at in that space to try and help. I think most of the micro apps, the micro front ends themselves, because they can optimize, what components they're including and discreetly in each application. It's not something that's been a massive bit of attention in that space, but I think in the more shared applications like the CMS, it is something that the guys are trying to implement.
Perfect. And then how do you maintain consistency of the learner shared components? Do you have a specific bundle for each app product? How do you maintain styles in this case?
Yeah, it is a bundle per app is what we do. So the learner code base is essentially a code base that's got all of the different components within one repository, and it sort of simplifies the mechanism so you can publish those as separate NPM modules that you can include. So each of the micro front ends has got a separate bundle, and it picks and chooses which of the component NPM modules it wants to include. Sorry, what was the last question on that? The CSS. In terms of the styling, I think the components themselves, I don't know if there's like a base component that's got a couple of standard styles in that most of the micro apps tend to include to give the sort of the overall color scheme, and then each component effectively references that one shared module. So there is some sharing of some base styles effectively, but then each of the subcomponents effectively is independent.
And then a question that you answered earlier, Chris, but what metrics are you using during this journey to measure your progress to make sure you are improving?
So we use a range of metrics in the teams that we look at, a team and a sort of, we have verticals, which are maybe a group of teams together, but we look at things like number of releases per team, story cycle time. We do a survey of team happiness, which I'm never quite sure if that's a great metric or not, just to get a sense of where the team is at. But generally, I mean, number of releases is the one that we've seen, see a significant increase as we move to this kind of pattern and more autonomy in the teams. But cycle time also helps because it tends to look at, right, are we splitting our stories into more achievable things? Are we getting substantial number of blockers? We also look at things like incidents and number of bugs and those types of things as a matter of course, but it tends to be release frequency and cycle time and just team happiness. That if the team is continually blocked, they're going to be frustrated. So it's something that we look at.
Perfect. Nick, you have the privilege of getting the last question because I'm mindful we've got 2 minutes to go, and I'm going to cut it down slightly. But how do you find working with a shared UI library in microservices, micro front end world?
Yeah, so I think the participant who asked the question thinks that they're possibly prone to bottlenecks and lots of deployments, lots of versioning. I think I really like them to give the sort of highlight of the answer, but how we avoid those problems and still reap the benefits of those shared components is by keeping the components quite dumb, in that, if on the click of a button you need to, the car insurance team need to raise an event that goes and talks to GA and does this and then does that and logs the user in, but somebody else needs to do 3 other different things. None of that goes into the component itself, and we don't keep extending the functionality. You keep it quite dumb in that the component can raise a data event. What you then do with that event in terms of firing it at GA or some other thing is then when you pull it into the app, that bit gets implemented. So, and then we also wrap it around not strict processes, because that sort of suggests bureaucracy and it taking a lot of time, but we have a clearly defined set of guidelines and that mean that the first people developing a component, say a drop-down box, build it in a way that has been agreed by that working group, and with that sort of dumb component mentality and other different principles in mind, so that the first iteration is pretty solid to use from the off and can then only be we're only finding minor updates are needed as people roll out and adopt more and more. And although, to be fair, it's relatively new, the learner module thing, and sort of only in the Moneysupermarket re-platform, I don't think we're seeing a lot of the problems that perhaps being suggested.
I think we did, though, in terms of, say, the shared CMS that we had. I think it's fair to say some of the foundational things that maybe as Nick is talking about is we're putting as a consequence of making a right pig's ear of it, where we did see it as a bit of an anti-pattern, that, you know, there was a huge variation between, you know, quite discrete components that were doing something simple, and, you know, components that were really complicated, really unwieldy, and just not conducive to the type of applications we want to build. So I think it is a hard lesson to learn, because I do think it's right. You've got to be really careful about drawing the line between reuse is great, but it can be a little bit of a shackle if you're not really clear on what you're trying to achieve by making that a reusable component.
Amazing. So I guess we've got to the end. I want to thank all of the team at Moneysupermarket Group. I think it's been a very, very informative conversation. I suspect we'll probably get a lot of follow-up after this event. Thank you very much to the audience. I can't believe that we've had so many people stay throughout the presentation. We've gone past 1 o'clock and we've still got a lot of people in the chat. So what we will do is I have copied and pasted all of the questions we didn't get to, so we'll find a way over the next few days just to start getting these answered. But thanks again for everyone attending.